She buried her father in full Navy uniform. But before the casket even hit the ground, two officers handcuffed her in front of her grieving family, accusing her of faking her service. What they didn't know, she was about to uncover a conspiracy that would shake the entire town, and they just picked the wrong veteran to silence. Stay with us. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. It was supposed to be a morning of closure, a final goodbye, wrapped in the quiet rituals of grief. Nothing more. A small town, a respected man laid to rest, and a daughter in uniform, honoring the only hero she'd ever truly known. But somewhere between the folded flag and the whispered prayers, two strangers with badges decided this funeral was the perfect place to make a different kind of statement. What unfolded next was never part of any service. And what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was who she really was and what she was about to uncover. The sky over Charleston's Memorial Grove Cemetery hung low, washed in the muted gray of a late October morning. A cool breeze swept through the trees, their last amber leaves flickering down in slow spirals. Commander Brielle Dawson stood at the head of the casket. Her Navy dress uniform pressed her posture, impeccable, not for show, for him. For her father, Wallace Dawson, retired firefighter, community mentor, and the kind of man who never let anyone fight alone. She didn't speak when the pastor asked if she wanted to say a few words. Her voice had cracked once already that morning, in the kitchen, helping her mother button her blouse, and again in the car when she saw the wreath they'd chosen sitting in the back seat. But here, she stood silent, letting the weight of her father's legacy speak for her. The service was small but steady, a cluster of family, a handful of retired firemen in worn dress blues, a few neighbors, an Army vet who'd served with her uncle. Nothing about it called attention. Nothing about it should have drawn suspicion. Brielle stepped forward as the casket was lowered. She knelt, touched the lid once gently. Her father hated fanfare, but he told her once, long before cancer took his lungs, that if she outlived him, she better stand proud at his grave, not just as my daughter, he'd said, as the woman you fought to become. She didn't cry, not when the pastor folded the last line of scripture, not even when the honor guard offered their salute. It wasn't stoicism, it was steel. The kind you forge from 12 years of service, from combat tours, and command briefings, from learning how to hold your fear like a loaded weapon tightly and carefully. "I'll be right back," she whispered to her mother, who nodded, fragile but composed. "Left my gloves in the car." Her car was parked near the edge of the cemetery, a dark gray SUV with a service sticker in the back window and a Blue Star license plate. As she crossed the gravel path, she didn't notice the patrol cruiser at first. It rolled in slow, almost lazy, pulling up directly behind her vehicle. When it stopped, two officers stepped out, one young, tall Buzz, cut the other, older, heavier eyes shielded behind mirrored sunglasses. Brielle's training told her to stay neutral. Don't assume. But the tight curl in her stomach told another story. The younger one approached first. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "can we have a word?" She glanced back toward the service. Her mother was watching, So were others. Of course, Brielle said. Is something wrong? Got a report of someone impersonating military personnel at this location. Matches your description. There was no room for confusion in his tone, no suggestion that this was a misunderstanding, only a quiet certainty that he'd found his target. I'm not impersonating anyone, Brielle replied. I'm Commander Brielle Dawson, U.S. Navy. That's my father's funeral. The older officer stayed silent, but kept a hand near his hip. The younger one narrowed his eyes. ID. She didn't hesitate, reached slowly into her uniform coat, and retrieved her military ID and state driver's license. You're welcome to verify both. He barely glanced. We've seen fakes before. Doesn't prove anything. She blinked, stunned. Are you seriously accusing me of stolen valor? He didn't answer. Turn around. Hands behind your back. There was a pause, barely a breath long. Brielle looked past him to the casket, to her mother, now struggling to stand. She saw panic ripple through her family, saw one of her father's old crewmen step forward, instinctively, fists clenched. She took a deep breath. This is a mistake, she said, and it's going to cost you. The cuffs were tight, deliberately tight. They bit into her wrists, as if punishment had already been declared. The older officer said nothing as he grabbed her arm and led her away from the car. Behind them, voices rose. That's Commander Dawson, she served. She's burying her dad. What the hell are you doing? Someone call the VA, call the base. Brielle didn't resist. She didn't speak. Not yet. Every muscle in her body ached with restraint, but she knew how this played out if she lost control. She was being marched through her father's funeral in uniform, in handcuffs, in front of his friends, his community, his wife. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have prepared for, was that she had one name already memorized. One call that would rewrite everything, because behind the silence of her lips and the steel of her spine, Brielle Dawson was already gathering the force that would bring a system to its knees. This was no longer about respect. It was about truth. And truth, once seen, doesn't go quietly. Stay with us. What happens next will shatter everything they thought they could get away with. The metal cuffs locked around Brielle Dawson's wrists weren't just cold. They were insulting. A final indignity, served with precision, tight enough to leave marks deliberate enough to signal intent. As the two officers flanked her on either side, leading her away from her father's gravesite, silence hung heavy over the crowd, like fog refusing to lift. But it wasn't just silence. It was disbelief. And then slowly, it became something else: anger. Back at the line of folding chairs, Brielle's mother rose shakily to her feet. She clutched the triangle-folded American flag as if it were the only anchor left keeping her upright. Her lips moved, but the words never left her mouth. Her daughter, a Navy commander, was being led away from her husband's funeral like a criminal, without explanation, without cause, and she was powerless to stop it. Across the cemetery, murmurs rose, first among the firemen who had once fought fires with Wallace Dawson, then among the veterans who stood shoulder to shoulder, recognizing not just the disrespect, but the danger in what was unfolding. A young woman, no more than 19, raised her phone, hit record, and held it steady as she stepped forward. She gave them her ID, the girl said, into the camera voice, trembling but determined. They didn't even look at it. They just cuffed her. Officer Cole, the younger of the two, didn't seem to notice or didn't care that people were watching now. that cameras were rolling, that the crowd he'd dismissed as mourners had quickly become something else entirely, witnesses. His face stayed tight, jaw-clenched eyes refusing to meet Brielle's. His partner, Officer Doherty, older and more seasoned, kept glancing at the crowd like a man who'd walked into a room expecting applause and found a jury instead. "Is there a reason for this?" Brielle asked as they neared the cruiser. Her voice was controlled, her shoulders squared despite the restraints. "Because if there is, I'd like it on record." "You matched a report," Cole said, opening the back door. "That's all we need." "You looked at my ID," she replied, calm but firm. "You saw my rank. You saw my name, and you ignored it." Doherty finally spoke low and dismissive. "You can argue all you want downtown." Behind them, the voices were louder now. "She's a decorated officer. She just buried her father. She's done more for this country than those two ever will." Cole shoved the door open wider. "In," he said. Brielle didn't move right away. She looked over her shoulder. The crowd had shifted. No longer passive, no longer quiet. Dozens of people had pulled out phones. A couple of retired Marines were now walking toward the cruiser with careful deliberation. A local journalist, invited to cover the funeral for the community page, had started live streaming without a word. "Commander Dawson," someone called out from the crowd. "What's happening?" Brielle turned her head slightly. "They claim I'm impersonating a military officer. I provided identification. They refuse to verify it." A gasp rippled through the gathering. Then from the far end of the cemetery, a voice bellowed, "That's nonsense." The man was tall, black mid-50s, wearing a Firehouse t-shirt tucked into slacks. His name was Artie Lambert, and he'd served with Wallace Dawson for 20 years. "I watched her grow up," he shouted. "I watched her deploy. This ain't justice, it's harassment." Cole stiffened. "Get in the car. Now." Brielle met his eyes. "I'm calling Admiral Kendall. You're not walking away from this." Cole looked at Doherty. They were no longer in control, and they knew it. Doherty muttered something under his breath and walked toward the patrol unit. Inside the cruiser, Brielle sat with her hands still cuffed. She twisted enough to get her phone from her pocket jaw, clenching at the pain in her wrists. With her thumb, she tapped the screen 3 times. One number. One call. The line rang once. Kendall, the voice answered. "Sir, I've been detained. Funeral. Charleston. Impersonation claim. ID ignored." There was a pause. "Stay put. I'm making calls. You're not alone." She ended the call and looked up. The glass of the cruiser window caught her reflection. Face composed, uniform, flawless wrists raw. She'd seen combat zones. She'd seen trauma. But never had she felt the kind of fire she felt now. Not from fear, but from injustice. Outside, the crowd had grown. More people were arriving. Someone had posted the video of her being cuffed. In 15 minutes, it had spread across town. Within 30, a national veterans group had picked it up. The title read, "Navy Commander, handcuffed at father's funeral without cause." Cole paced outside the cruiser, his face reddening. Doherty stayed near the trunk radio, at his ear voice, low but urgent. Both men were no longer acting. They were reacting. And the eyes that had once looked away now watched them with intent. Brielle's mother stepped forward, despite her trembling legs. She looked at Cole. "My daughter," she said, voice breaking, "served this country with more courage than you'll ever understand. You should be ashamed." Cole didn't respond, but the silence that followed felt louder than any siren. Then in the distance, another vehicle approached. a black SUV, government plates. It didn't flash lights. It didn't blare horns. It just pulled in and stopped directly behind the cruiser. Out stepped a woman in a dark suit, phone still to her ear, expression sharp. She approached the officers and spoke just loud enough for the growing circle of witnesses to hear. Who authorized the detainment of Commander Dawson Cole? Straightened. We received a tip. Did you verify identification? She matched the description. That's not an answer. That's an excuse. The woman turned, stepped toward the cruiser, and tapped on the window. Brielle met her eyes. Recognition passed silently between them. The woman opened the door and said calmly, "You're being released. Orders from Naval Command." Brielle stepped out slowly. Her wrists were red, imprinted with silver lines. The cuffs clinked once before hitting the officer's hands. But the damage had already been done, and the eyes that had watched quietly from the sidelines were now ready to speak. The truth had been denied. But the witnesses, they weren't going anywhere, because the world had just watched a woman in uniform get humiliated at her father's funeral. And now they were watching to see what she'd do next. Brielle Dawson had spent years building a name that meant something. In operations rooms around the world, on ships slicing through the South China Sea, and in humanitarian missions off the coast of Haiti, her name had carried weight. Commander Dawson, the woman who held the line when others faltered, the one who made chaos make sense. And yet in the space of a few heartbeats, that same name had been reduced to suspicion in the hands of two officers who refused to look past the color of her skin. But they had miscalculated one thing: who she was connected to. By the time Brielle was released from the cruiser, the calls had already rippled through the hierarchy. Admiral Elaine Kendall, known for her precision and her refusal to bow to political optics, had been watching everything unfold in real time. She wasn't just her superior, she was her mentor. And when Admiral Kendall moved, she moved with the weight of the Pentagon behind her. The woman who had arrived to free Brielle was Lieutenant Myra Shields, a senior officer from the Naval Legal Service Command. Her presence alone shifted the balance. No raised voices, no grand gestures, just protocol, wielded by someone who actually understood its purpose. "You're to remain on site," she said firmly to Officers Cole and Doherty. "Internal affairs is en route. This is now a matter of federal oversight." They didn't argue. Not because they understood, but because they no longer had control. Brielle stood next to the woman, flexing her wrists, slowly aware of the hush that had fallen across the cemetery. Her mother stood nearby, supported by neighbors and friends, her expression a mixture of relief and something deeper wounded pride. The type that didn't scream, but stayed behind the eyes and never left. Brielle's voice cut the air with quiet certainty. "I want a formal record. I want every camera, every witness statement preserved." Lieutenant Shields nodded. "Already done. We've pulled the live streams. 3 local affiliates are documenting everything. You're not alone in this." She knew that. But knowing didn't dull the sting. She had spent her entire life earning her place, not just in uniform, but in the stories whispered behind closed doors, the respect earned after 2 a.m. Decisions in war rooms, the salute from a junior officer who knew what it took to rise. That kind of respect wasn't bought. It wasn't inherited. It was forged, and it carried the weight of generations before her who never had the chance to wear a uniform at all. And now, thanks to 2 careless men and a lie called in, From a disposable phone, she was standing at her father's funeral with her wrists still sore and her name under question. Across the lot, she could hear snippets of conversation from the gathering crowd. "She's Commander Dawson." They cuffed her like a criminal. They didn't even check her credentials. Her name was being passed from person to person now, not as gossip, as a rallying point. By the time Internal Affairs arrived, two sharp-suited investigators with badges already out, the narrative was no longer up for interpretation. The videos showed everything: the disrespect, the dismissiveness, the refusal to verify her ID. But more importantly, it showed her calm, compliant, and professional. Everything the uniform demanded. Everything those officers had chosen to ignore. The lead investigator approached Brielle with careful words. "Commander Dawson, I want to begin by apologizing on behalf of the department. What happened today shouldn't have happened. We'll be conducting a full inquiry, including into the origin of the tip that brought them here." Brielle nodded. "That's a start. We'd also like to request a statement." "You'll get it," she said, "but not just here. Not just to you. I'll be giving my account on record to both Military Council and the Department of Justice." The investigator blinked. He hadn't expected her to move so quickly, so forcefully. But then he didn't really know her. Later that evening, Brielle sat inside a quiet meeting room at the Naval Legal Office downtown. The American flag framed the far wall. A digital recorder blinked red. Lieutenant Shields sat to her right, an attorney for the Navy to her left. She wasn't in uniform now. She had changed into civilian clothes. Dark jeans, a crisp white blouse. But her presence hadn't changed. If anything stripped of the uniform, the story landed harder. They approached without cause, she began. "I had just finished my father's eulogy. I was walking to my vehicle when they stopped me." She recounted it all. The way they ignored her ID, the way they dismissed her service, the cuffs, the tone, the intent. "Do you believe their actions were racially motivated?" the attorney asked carefully. She met his eyes. "I believe they were designed to diminish me. Whether because of my race, my gender, or the fact that I wore a uniform they didn't respect, that's their burden to prove. But yes, I believe race played a role." He nodded and wrote something down. Then he asked, "Do you want to pursue legal action?" Her voice didn't waver. "Yes." The report was filed by midnight. By dawn, a dozen outlets had picked up the footage. By noon, her name was trending nationwide. But it wasn't the disgrace the officers had assumed. It wasn't the humiliation they had intended. The name Commander Brielle Dawson now stood for something else, a reckoning. Across naval bases and veteran networks, service members began posting tributes. "She stood for us when they tried to tear her down. We are all Brielle." Hashtags appeared. Civil rights groups reached out. A former JAG officer offered to represent her pro bono. And through it all, Brielle stayed grounded. She didn't ask for any of this. But now that it had come, she would face it head on. Because names like hers were never meant to be whispered. They were meant to echo through halls that had too long been silent, through systems that had too long been blind, and through the hearts of every person who had ever worn a uniform only to be told they didn't belong. She wasn't going to shout. She didn't need to. At first, the people of Beaufort didn't know what to do with the anger rising in their throats. Beaufort, South Carolina, was a town of rituals and reputations. Sunday service and fried fish Fridays. A place where people held open doors, nodded at each other in grocery stores, and knew how many sons a firefighter had before the obituary ran. It was a quiet coastal place that wore its charm like a well-fitted blazer, tidy, familiar, unthreatening. But what happened at Port Royal Cemetery on that October morning had cracked something deeper than just a moment of mistaken identity. When Commander Brielle Dawson was handcuffed in full uniform at her father's funeral, that image, her back straight, wrists bound, flanked by two officers who had dismissed both her rank and her dignity, seared itself into the town's conscience. And Beaufort, for once, did not look away. The footage had spread faster than anyone anticipated. It wasn't just the live stream, though, that helped. It was the faces caught in the background. Familiar ones. Miss Leona from the diner, Pastor Griffin from Calvary Baptist, Mr. Hill, the retired postal worker with the limp who coached youth baseball for decades. The whole town saw its own watching it happen, and then slowly saw themselves in it too. By midday, what had been whispered became a collective hum. Calls were made, neighborhood groups lit up. Someone organized a town forum by 5 p.m. at the community center, and by 4:30, the parking lot was full. Inside, there were no banners, no slogans, just folding chairs, a microphone, and an uneasy silence that gave way to something raw. The first to speak was Pastor Griffin. He didn't come with fire or fury. He came with grief. She buried her father in uniform, he said, and was treated like she came to rob the place. This is not about law and order. This is about power and presumption. A few nodded. A few wept. Some simply sat still, unsure of how to respond. Then came Joy Alvarez, a local teacher and military spouse. When my husband deployed last year, Commander Dawson personally checked on our kids while he was gone. She brought groceries, helped with homework, sat through a school board meeting on our behalf. That's the kind of officer she is. That's the kind of woman they threw into cuffs like she was a threat. Her voice cracked. She didn't apologize. Then Mr. Hill stood. I was at the funeral. I saw what those officers did. And I ain't ever felt so small in my life watching them treat her like that. And knowing that if I stepped forward, I might end up in cuffs too. But I should have stepped anyway. That was when the shift happened. It wasn't about the cuffs anymore. It wasn't even about just Brielle. It was about the culture they had all let settle in quietly over time, the unquestioned authority, the double standards, the silent tolerance of a system that could take a decorated veteran and reduce her to a suspect in seconds. And so they organized. By the next morning, local businesses had signs in their windows. We stand with Commander Dawson. A muralist painted her silhouette on a wall downtown, the word honor painted beneath it. Churches lit candles in vigil. Students wore navy blue to school in solidarity. Veterans came out of retirement to speak on her behalf, not just on camera, but in classrooms and council chambers. The high school civics teacher, Mr. Jennings, changed his curriculum that week. We're going to talk about systems, he told his students, about checks and balances, about when those checks fail, and what it means when silence is no longer an option. A local cafe offered free coffee to anyone who could show they'd written a letter to the police oversight board or their state representative. Within 72 hours, over 600 letters had been sent. But what struck Brielle most was what she didn't expect: the people who'd once said nothing who now couldn't say enough. Detective Harris, a black officer with 2 decades in the Beaufort PD, showed up at her home in plain clothes one evening. He didn't stay long, just long enough to say what they did was wrong. If there's an internal review, I'll testify. So did Ms. Lyle, the town librarian, who admitted she'd once crossed the street when she saw a group of teens in uniform hoodies, after dark kids now inspired by Brielle's composure. I was scared for no reason, she told her congregation, and that's exactly the reason we're here now. The pressure mounted. Local officials tried to deflect, calling it a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand. But the town wasn't buying it, not this time. They'd seen too much, heard too much, felt too much. The town council called an emergency session. The mayor, once a fixture at ribbon cuttings and parades, now faced his constituents with downcast eyes. He tried to offer platitudes. He was met with silence. Then from the back of the room came a voice clear and low. Say her name. The crowd answered Commander Brielle Dawson. Say what happened. She was cuffed. At her father's funeral. In uniform. It wasn't a chant. It was a reckoning. That night, when Brielle stood on her porch, she saw a line of luminarias stretching down her block, one placed by each household, each flickering with a quiet vow, we saw, we remember. She didn't cry. She stood taller, because the town, that once let injustice pass quietly, had found its voice. And it wasn't whispering anymore. They couldn't undo what had happened to her. They couldn't erase the click of the cuffs, the weight of humiliation. But they could make sure the name she had earned echoed beyond the base, beyond the courtroom, beyond the moment. Brielle had always stood for something. Now Beaufort did too. When Commander Brielle Dawson entered the courthouse for the last time, she wore her Navy uniform not as a shield, but as a statement. It wasn't about ceremony. It wasn't even about pride. It was about clarity, an answer to every doubt, every insult, every assumption that had tried to redefine her identity at her own father's funeral. The same uniform that two officers had dismissed now became the undeniable symbol of truth inside those courtroom walls. The judge, a veteran himself, recognized what the insignias meant without needing them explained. The courtroom was silent as Brielle took her seat, but the silence carried a current charged with the weight of everything that had unfolded, the wrongful arrest, the crowd that bore witness the anonymous call, traced to hate, and the wave of support that grew louder with every passing day. The evidence was irrefutable video footage, body cam audio, eyewitnesses' digital records. But it was Brielle's composure throughout that shifted the room. She had not shouted. She had not lashed out. Instead, she had stood her ground when every instinct would have forgiven her for breaking. When the judge read the verdict, finding in her favor, ordering damages, and recommending permanent decertification of the officers involved, there was no applause. There was only stillness, the kind that comes after a storm when the air is changed and nothing will be the same again. Outside, the press waited, cameras blinking like anxious eyes. But Brielle didn't address them. She walked straight to her mother, took her hand, and said, "He can rest now." That was the justice she wanted most, not headlines or compensation, but dignity returned, memory restored. In the weeks that followed, legislation moved quickly. New protocols were passed, oversight measures strengthened, and anonymous emergency reports faced tighter scrutiny. The uniform was no longer a question. It was a confirmation. Brielle returned to duty quietly, turning down interviews and awards. What mattered wasn't the noise around the story. It was the quiet that followed the space where change could take root. Cadets sent letters. Veterans showed up at her base just to say thank you. And somewhere, in a small town, still healing children, grew up with one more example of what strength looks like when it's worn with grace. Justice didn't roar in this story. It walked in calmly, shoulders, squared head, held high, and it wore full uniform. Final and action. What began as a daughter's solemn farewell to her father became a national reckoning, a moment that pierced the silence often wrapped around systemic injustice. Commander Brielle Dawson didn't set out to become a symbol. She only wanted to honor the man who had taught her to serve, to protect, to walk with dignity in every step she took. But fate doesn't always ask for permission. When two officers decided that her uniform and ID weren't enough, when they chose suspicion over respect and prejudice over procedure, they didn't just detain a veteran, they ignited a movement. Every step of Brielle's journey, being wrongfully cuffed at her father's funeral, watching her mother's hands shake as she held the folded flag, hearing her service dismissed as dress up, should have broken something. Instead, it revealed everything. The footage didn't just show misconduct. It revealed a culture too comfortable with doubting black identity even in uniform. The anonymous call wasn't just a prank. It was a calculated attempt to weaponize law enforcement against someone who dared to wear both her race and her service on her sleeve. And yet Brielle didn't crumble. She stood still. She used the power of her voice not to scream, but to state the truth clearly. She called Admiral Fields not because she needed saving, but because she understood the power of protocol, of chain of command, of strategic action. The moment the public heard her voice through live streams, the lie could no longer live. Her truth echoed louder. That truth spread from the local VFW halls to the governor's office, from veterans posting online to civilians confronting their own assumptions. Officers were terminated, a hate group was exposed, new laws were introduced, but most importantly, minds began to shift. The uniform didn't protect her that day, but her response redefined what the uniform should mean for everyone. So what can we learn from Brielle Dawson first? That silence is never neutral. Choosing not to speak up when injustice unfolds only makes space for more of it. But speaking up doesn't always mean yelling. Sometimes it means holding your ground, with poise, keeping receipts, and letting the truth do the heavy lifting. Second, that bias doesn't need a badge to operate. It lives in the assumptions we carry. That a woman, a black woman, could serve 12 years in the Navy and still be doubted speaks volumes about what society chooses to see and what it chooses to ignore. Changing that requires more than policy. It requires internal rewiring. It requires asking, why did I assume what I assumed? And what will I do differently next time? And finally, Brielle's story reminds us that dignity can be an act of resistance, that choosing composure in the face of humiliation isn't weakness, it's power, real generational power, the kind that lives in courtroom transcripts and policy reform, the kind that shapes the next officer's decision when they see someone like her again. If her story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that justice often begins with one person refusing to shrink, don't let it end here. Share this video. Talk about it. Reflect on it. Teach your children, your friends, your coworkers. And if you want to see more stories, like this, stories that challenge, that uplift, that expose truth and honor, courage, subscribe to this channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep digging, to keep telling what matters, and to keep honoring those who refuse to back down. Because this isn't just about the past. It's about building the future together.